Zarah Sultana.
And Deputy Speaker, in Britain today, trans women are denied safe housing, refused essential healthcare and left waiting years for gender-affirming treatment. This is not accidental. It is the result of a climate of hostility against a marginalised community fuelled by people in positions of power, including in this very chamber. So let me be clear, trans people are not a debate, a culture war or an ideology. They are human beings and trans rights are human rights. So I ask the Minister, will this government ensure that it doesn't pander to hate? Will it reverse its damaging rollback of LGBT plus rights, including the ban on puberty blockers, and unequivocally defend the Equality Act and the protections it provides for trans people across the UK?
Minister.
The Honourable Lady asked a number of questions there. What I can say to her is that trans people, of course, deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, and they retain rights to live their lives free of discrimination and harassment as set out in the Supreme Court judgment. She asks about puberty blockers. I'm afraid there is going to be no change to government policy in this important area.
Richard Tice.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Now we've got confirmation from the Supreme Court what the definition of a woman is. Could the Secretary of State confirm that all public sector and private sector bodies will apply that definition with immediate effect?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Equality and Human Rights Commission will set out a statutory code of practice that will provide further clarity. But I would just say to the honourable gentleman that I'll take no lectures from his party about the importance of defending women's rights, given that one of his own number that sits on those benches was convicted and went to prison for assaulting his former partner.
Emily Darlington.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. There are some days I'm really proud to be an MP and the level of debate in this chamber, and there are some days like today when, quite frankly, the Leader of the Opposition was absolutely appalling. She continues to talk over people, not listen, laugh at people while they're talking about an issue that is very, very serious. People out there are scared as a result of this judgment, and they will... Could you maybe let me speak? Sorry, apologies. Sorry, could the honourable member allow me the politeness of not speaking over me?
Keep going.
My question, and I will ask a question, when it...
Order. I do appreciate that feelings are running high in this statement. However, please do ask your question and put it on the record.
Do you think that, does the Secretary of State agree with me, the debate in this chamber is listened to by those people who are today scared, and the behaviour of the Leader of the Opposition in talking over people, laughing at people, and when cis men violence was mentioned, the opposite benches laughed. That does not reassure women or trans women in this country. Does she agree?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I agree that where we discuss these matters, they are sensitive and they do generate strong feelings. And it is, of course, right that in this House we are able to engage in robust discussion, including on issues that might at times be difficult. But I accept the point that my honourable friend is making, that we do need to treat one another with respect and understand the need. So much for dignity and respect, eh?
Rebecca Paul.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the clear ruling from the Supreme Court, and I thank the Secretary of State for her statement. However, I'm really disappointed that there was no mention of schools at all in her statement. Many schools are teaching gender ideology as if it is fact. They are not providing single-sex facilities and single-sex sports teams. How will she ensure that they now, going forwards, comply with the rules and the law, as it has always been?
Secretary of State.
I'd suggest to the honourable lady that after this session she reviews Hansard.
Melanie Ward.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Following the welcome clarity from the Supreme Court that Labour's Equality Act has always contained the right to single-sex spaces for women, as well as protections for trans people, does the Secretary of State agree that the SNP Scottish Health Secretary must urgently get a grip and ensure the NHS is upholding the law, especially in my area of Fife, where it appears that a nurse, Sandy Peggy, was disciplined by NHS managers for trying to access her right to use a single-sex changing room.
Secretary of State.
My honourable friend will understand that I'm not in a position to comment on ongoing cases, but what I can say to her is that I agree that the Supreme Court ruling demonstrated that the Equality Act that the last Labour government introduced is the basis on which single-sex provision based on biological sex should be delivered.
Tom Gordon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State says that the ruling provides clarity, but with trans constituents that I met and corresponded with over the weekend, it provides anxiety and fear. A local media outlet, the Stray Ferret, last week published an article documenting a 60% increase in trans hate crime in the last decade in North Yorkshire alone. I and many others worry that the rhetoric and language around this issue will only fuel that. So can the Secretary of State confirm how the government will ensure trans people, who are already disproportionately targeted, are not marginalised further, and that the upcoming EHRC guidance addresses the safety and inclusion as seriously as it does the legal clarity?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling from the Supreme Court was clear, but he is right that there can be no place for hate and no place for people to be targeted on that basis, and it is important that action is taken against those who perpetrate hate crime.
Mayor Ellis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Like many of my colleagues today, I am truly exhausted by the cynicism of the culture wars around this topic, and I hope we can focus on how we make any changes work practically. Would the Secretary of State agree with me that all of us in this House should be mindful that there are human beings affected by every comment we make on this matter, and how we behave here will inform how the wider public behave, which I hope would be with kindness and compassion.
I agree, Madam Deputy Speaker, that everyone in our society should be treated with dignity, with compassion and respect. And the Supreme Court ruling, while setting out its position on biological sex, was also clear that trans people retain important protections in law, including where it applies to discrimination and harassment. And I do believe it is important, Madam Deputy Speaker, that all of us share that message in understanding the ruling and in making sure that it is well understood across our country, because the last thing that any of us would want is for trans people to be fearful. That's right.
Richard Holden.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Deputy Speaker. I want everyone treated with dignity and respect, as the Supreme Court made clear. But should women have to rely on a court ruling followed by guidance at some point from the EHRC rather than the clear view of this House? And what would the government's view be of primary legislation in this area rather than relying on a court ruling?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, the ruling of the Supreme Court was that the Equality Act, which was passed by this House, is the basis for the protections that exist in law on the basis of biological sex.
Toby Perkins.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. I've had very constructive discussions with constituents on both sides of this debate. But does the Secretary of State agree with me that those who seek to promote trans rights with sexually aggressive placards or through aggressively threatening women who disagree with them in the most disgusting ways, as we've all seen, do tremendous harm to the trans cause and should realise how counterproductive their slogans are to the cause that they're attempting to promote?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, no one should be targeted through the use of vile placards containing abuse or hate, and he is absolutely right. I agree with him. Not only is that wrong, but as he says, it is completely counterproductive. It does nothing to advance the discussion that those who present those placards would wish. And it is important, whilst I understand that people have strong opinions in this area, that through any discussion or any debate, that does not take us to hate-filled rhetoric, threats of violence or intimidation.
Neil O'Brien.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Secretary of State says that her position on these issues is very clear and hasn't changed at all over the years, and she's promising to work at pace now. And yet, 9 months into her time as Education Secretary, the guidance that was consulted on over a year ago has still not been published on gender questioning children. So can the Secretary of State help schools by answering this question? Can it ever be right for a school to socially transition a child without talking to the parents first?
Secretary of State.
Madam Deputy Speaker, we will set out guidance this year for gender questioning children. It is important because I will answer the question. I will answer the question directly if the Right Honourable Lady would